Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about meat production, and we've kind of already alluded to this if you watched the video lecture, but I just want to clarify a few things and I want to go over some major points. So most of your meat, especially if you buy meat that is extremely cheap, so you buy that tube at Walmart that's like $3 for like 2 pounds or whatever it is, or you're buying that burger off the dollar menu, most of that meat is made in what we call a feedlot or a factory farm or a concentrated animal feeding operation, so a CAFO. This could be made, there are CAFOs for beef, there's CAFOs for chicken, there's CAFOs for pork, there's CAFOs for fish. So any kind of protein source, we're going to see a CAFO. So it's not necessarily just with beef. You can see a little picture here. I used to live in Dallas, and so when I would drive between Dallas and Colorado, there's a big one kind of outside of Amarillo, and like you can smell it when you're getting close. So these are huge warehouses or pens designed to deliver energy-rich food, corn, doesn't matter, cows, fish, pork, chicken, all of it's corn, to animals that are living at very, very high densities. So here you can see the increase in meat production from 1950 to 2010. That production would not have occurred if it wasn't for CAFOs. I want to be clear that we need beef, we need protein, and we need a lot of the products that are coming out of these cows. So we have to have some of these. We just want to look at it and say, what are the disadvantages, and are some of the disadvantages outweighing the advantages? You can see that now the majority of millions of tons of meat production is now coming out of China as compared to the United States. So we want to be careful. Where is our meat coming from? Is it coming from a different place and we're having to be importing it, or is it coming from um, local ranches that we can support? And that's really our best case scenario. So every time we use a CAFO, 90% of the energy that we're putting into the production of this meat product is lost from the time it moves from the tropic level to the next. So example, when we feed all of these cows corn, then we're losing the majority of the energy. The lower on the food chain we eat, the better we're off we're going to be, and the more people we can support on earth. So we're not saying you can't ever eat meat. We're just saying that if you ate less meat, we could support more people. Some animals convert grain into meat more efficiently. And so what we see here on the right-hand side is this image that the amount of energy that we have to put in order to get out one weight of kilogram in protein production. So for example, we put in 20 kilograms of energy to get out 1 kilogram of beef. Is that really efficient? Is that really the way that we want to go? Most of the land and the water that we use to raise food is the land and the water, let me start again. The land and the water that we need to raise food for livestock is significantly more than when we just eat at a lower food chain, so we eat vegetables. So for example, here, in order to produce 1 kilogram of beef, we need 245 metric tons. To do a more plant-based product, we would need even less. And that's because you have to have land for the cows and you have to have land for the food that they're eating. Same thing with water. So much of the resources go into producing the food that the animal is eating. Again, we don't want to say get rid of all of it. We're not all going to be vegetarians, but we want to say, can we eat less? Can we do this more efficiently? So we've seen that global meat production tends to increase, and most of this is now coming out of Asia. And so I want to go back here. One of the major disadvantages to this is that it uses huge amounts of fossil fuels. We're going to have to ship in let me start again. We're going to use pesticides and fertilizers to raise the grain. Then we need to use fossil fuels in order to harvest them. We need fossil fuels in order to use the machinery to spray with pesticides and fertilizers. Then we have to transport the grain to the cows. We have to raise the cows. Those cows are butchered. We have to use fossil fuels to transport that meat. Not to say that we don't need it in other kinds of food production. For example, in grass-fed production, we still need some transportation, but we're not raising grain with pesticides and fertilizers, so that fossil fuel consumption is going to decline. The other huge problem with CAFOs are twofold. So the first one is that it uses huge amounts of fossil fuels. The second one is that all these animals poop a lot. Everything poops. Where are you going to put all this waste? And so sometimes it runs off. When it rains, it runs off into a nearby water source. That's going to cause eutrophication when the DO levels are going to plummet because of all of the waste. And we'll talk about that at a later time. So First problem was fossil fuel consumption. Second problem is huge amounts of waste. We can see these massive waste lagoons when we look at large CAFOs. Sometimes pork production is really big on the eastern coast, like in parts of North Carolina. And when they're hit with hurricanes, we can see these huge lagoons of waste that are now flowing into the ocean. And anytime you have a lot of animals like this, you're going to have unwanted pests. This can be bacteria. Maybe you've heard of E. coli outbreaks or salmonella outbreaks in chicken farming. And these tend to be more common because the density of the animals are really high. And so we as or humans that are raising these kind of things tend to inject heavy amounts of antibiotics so that the animals stay healthy. The more antibiotics we use, the more antibiotic resistance we're going to see. So sometimes we give antibiotics even though the animal isn't sick. We give them so that they grow bigger, faster, stronger, and we give it so that it prevents them from getting sick. And what happens is the bacteria that are naturally living inside of them become immune to the antibiotics that we're using. And so we've seen that antibiotic resistance has increased. So some of the bacteria are naturally able to survive. They're going to survive and reproduce. So we're going to use an even stronger antibiotic to get rid of them. Not to say that we don't need to use antibiotics if an animal is sick. We absolutely do. We're talking about the use of antibiotics to prevent disease and to make them grow bigger in a shorter time frame. And so that's particularly bad. So the three major problems coming out of CAFOs are the excessive use of fossil fuels, the excessive amounts of waste, and the overuse of growth hormone and antibiotics that are going to cause antibiotic resistance and cause problems when those enter into humans or can cause infections. So we just have a couple of more figures to discuss. We've seen that global meat production increases. We've talked about the amount of land that we can use. Meat production tends to go up as countries move through the demographic transition. So developed countries tend to eat more meat because we have more discretionary income than, say, developing countries. And again, most of the greenhouse gases are coming from just 25% of all greenhouse gases come from food production, but some of that is associated with meat production. So we don't want to use CAFOs. We want to make a transition towards more sustainable, like even ranching. So what that might be is you would have a specific amount of space and the cows are allowed to live on that. We call that free range. And so what happens is that I'm trying to see if I have a picture here. So I'm going to go all the way back. Don't look, this will hurt your eyes. And so what we want to see is that we want to allow animals to graze. This actually is more beneficial for the ecosystems. They eat grass. That's what cows were evolved to eat. They were not evolved to eat corn. And so we want to constantly just allow these cows to graze. We rely on rainwater in order to water the plants, lower amounts of pesticides, lower amounts of fertilizers, because they're in low density. We're not seeing the excessive use of antibiotics. We're not seeing the excessive use of growth hormones. These animals tend to be happier. They tend to be healthier, and they tend to therefore have a better quality meat production. They tend to taste better. And what we know is that the farmers and the ranchers that grow their or that raise beef in this way tend to take better care of the resources. Not to say that the people that are running CAFOs don't, but those are typically large companies as compared to individual ranchers who really have a stake in ensuring that their meat is not destroying the land that they own. The other thing to consider is just ensuring that we're moving the animals that are grazing around. Otherwise, what we see is overgrazing tends to happen when they eat away at too much of the plant, too much of the grass, and therefore that grass is lost and the dirt is exposed and we see soil erosions. So there's a fine line between CAFOs and grain production, and free range production, but we want to make sure we find that middle ground. Remember that beef production is really, really important. It's a huge part of the economy. It's a valuable protein source. We don't want to say we're going to get rid of it. We just want to ensure that we're doing it in an appropriate manner that enables us to produce meat in the long term. So hopefully that was helpful. There's a couple of other videos on meat production that you want to make sure that you watch.